Imagine standing on a quiet Boston street when the ground beneath you begins to tremble. A sound like rolling thunder surges through the air, metal screaming, tearing itself apart. And then, before you can even breathe, you see it. A wall of darkness rushing straight at you, 25 feet high, moving faster than a horse at full gallop. That wall is made of molasses. Subscribe now so you don't miss more stories that history tried to bury. It may sound absurd, even comical, but in January of 1919, this was no joke. For the men, women, and children of Boston's North End, it was a nightmare. They were trapped inside one of the strangest and deadliest disasters America has ever seen. The story doesn't begin with the flood itself. It begins years earlier, with a decision born of greed, haste, and arrogance. The Purity Distilling Company had a problem to solve in 1915. The First World War was raging, and the demand for munitions was soaring. Molasses wasn't just for cookies and candy. It was a crucial ingredient in producing industrial alcohol, the fuel for explosives. Every gallon meant profit, and profit had to be stored somewhere. Boston's North End, with its shipping lanes and docks, was the perfect spot. And so, the company ordered the construction of a massive steel tank to hold shipments of molasses arriving from the Caribbean. But there was no time to lose. The deadline was insane: finish the tank in just 2 months. The man in charge? Not an engineer. Not an architect. Just Arthur Gell, the company's secretary, someone with no experience in building anything more complicated than an office memo. Still, Gell pressed forward. He hired Hammond's Iron Works, cut corners at every step, and used steel thinner than recommended. He skipped crucial safety tests. Rivets were too few, too weak. And when leaks appeared, instead of fixing them, the company painted the tank brown so the oozing molasses wouldn't show. Neighbors noticed the ominous groans. They joked about it, even let their children scoop up the sticky drippings from the seams. But beneath those harmless games lurked a giant ticking bomb, 2.3 million gallons of pressure waiting to explode. For 3 years, the monster towered over the neighborhood, a shadow cast in steel and sweet, sticky danger. Residents walked beneath it every day, not realizing they were living in the path of death. And then came January 15, 1919, a mild winter afternoon. The tank nearly full, fresh molasses from the Caribbean delivered only days before. But the warmth of that shipment created immense pressure inside. The steel began to strain. Rivets rattled like gunfire. No one in Boston's North End could have imagined what would come next. The first sound was sharp, like a rifle shot. Then another, and another. But it wasn't gunfire. It was rivets, one by one, snapping loose under unbearable pressure. The steel monster was breaking apart. At 12:30 in the afternoon, the tank surrendered. With a deafening roar, 2.3 million gallons of boiling black molasses exploded into the streets. A tidal wave 25 feet high surged forward with the force of dynamite, racing at 35 miles an hour. People barely had time to scream. Imagine you are 65-year-old Bridget Clougherty, stepping out of your North End home to hang laundry. Suddenly, the world darkens. A wall of liquid looms over you, thick, sticky, unstoppable. There is nowhere to run. The force knocks you down. In seconds, you are buried. Or picture a child chasing after a ball. The sound catches your attention, but curiosity becomes terror as the wave hits. Molasses is not water. It clings, it smothers. You try to fight, but every movement only drags you deeper. Breathing feels like drowning in syrup. Buildings crumbled as though they were toys. Wooden houses splintered into floating wreckage. Horses pulling wagons were swallowed whole, their desperate cries muffled beneath the sludge. Even the iron girders of Boston's elevated train line bent and twisted as if made of clay. The smell was suffocating, sweet, sickly, inescapable. Survivors would later say it was as if the city itself was being embalmed in sugar. The chaos was unimaginable. People tried to flee, but running in molasses was like running in quicksand. Rescuers could hardly move. Every step sank them deeper into the waist-high flood. Those who didn't drown outright were crushed by debris, planks, barrels, or even the collapsing walls of their own homes. A 2-block radius was destroyed in minutes. 21 people would never rise again. More than 150 lay injured, pinned beneath rubble, sticky and gasping for air. In the heart of the North End, time froze. A neighborhood became a graveyard. And yet, this was only the beginning of Boston's nightmare. Because once the waves settled, another battle began, the desperate struggle to save those trapped in the suffocating mess. When the roar faded, silence never came, only screams. The wave of molasses had torn through 2 city blocks, and what it left behind looked like a battlefield. Buildings were snapped like matchsticks, wagons overturned, and people trapped beneath a blanket of sticky, suffocating darkness. Imagine opening your eyes and realizing you are still alive, but unable to move. The molasses clings to your arms and legs like tar, pulling at your clothes, sealing your mouth whenever you try to scream. Every breath is a fight. The sweet scent you once associated with candy now becomes the stench of death. The first rescuers were locals. Neighbors rushed out with nothing but bare hands, shovels, and boards to pry victims loose. But every step was a nightmare. Men sank waist deep, shoes ripped from their feet, bodies dragged backward as if the ground itself was fighting them. Some collapsed from exhaustion after only a few yards. Soon firefighters and police arrived, pushing their way through the sticky hell. Their boots gummed up, their arms leaden. It was like wading through glue, one man later recalled. Every move felt like it would be your last. They heard faint cries under the molasses, muffled, distant. Sometimes they dug for minutes, only to pull out a lifeless body. Other times, they uncovered someone still breathing, face crusted with syrup, gasping in shock. The difference between life and death could be just a few inches of air. For some, the horror was instant. A freight car was lifted and hurled into a building, its driver crushed beneath the weight. Horses thrashed violently, eyes wide with terror, until the thick syrup pulled them down for good. People who tried to outrun the wave found themselves stuck mid-stride, legs trapped like insects in amber. For others, death came slower. Neighbors later told of hearing knocking sounds inside collapsed houses, survivors trapped within, pounding on walls, calling out for help that came too late. Even the strongest men could not resist the flood. Entire rescue crews nearly drowned while trying to save others. Firemen wrapped ropes around their bodies, so they could be pulled out if they sank too deep. By nightfall, the scene resembled something out of a nightmare. Lanterns flickered in the freezing air as workers hacked through debris with axes, their clothes stiff with molasses that had already begun to harden in the cold. The sticky mass clung to hair, skin, and eyelashes. Every rescuer looked like a statue carved in dark sugar. And still, the cries of the trapped continued. Some were saved, others silenced. Boston's North End had become a swamp of death, where the sweetness of molasses turned into a suffocating poison. But when dawn came, the nightmare wasn't over. It was only spreading. By sunrise on January 16, 1919, Boston's North End no longer looked like a city neighborhood. It looked like a swamp of nightmares. 2 blocks were buried under a crust of hardened molasses. Horses lay twisted like broken toys, their bodies half submerged. Freight cars stuck out of the goo at odd angles, as if frozen mid-explosion. Houses leaned, some torn from their foundations, their walls dripping black syrup. And in the middle of it all, silence. A silence broken only by the sound of shovels scraping, axes splitting wood, and the low moans of survivors still waiting to be pulled free. Rescue quickly became cleanup, but cleanup was almost impossible. The molasses did not behave like water. It clung, it resisted, it mocked every effort. Crews tried blasting it with fresh water from hydrants, useless. They dragged in hoses from the harbor, pumping salt water to wash the streets. But even then, every sweep of water only spread the stickiness further, turning cobblestones into slick death traps. Men shoveled sand across the streets to soak it up, but sand just turned into thick brown sludge. Workers had to cut away debris piece by piece, sometimes finding crushed bodies underneath. Firefighters wrapped rags around their faces to endure the smell, but it seeped through anyway, sweet, heavy, suffocating. Everything was brown, one rescuer later remembered. The streets, the walls, even the gloves on our hands. And the smell, God, the smell was everywhere. Boston was paralyzed. Horses struggled to pull wagons through the syrup-soaked streets. Trolleys could not run. Their wheels were cemented in place. Shoes stuck fast to the ground. Men cursed as they tried to pry their boots free, leaving soles behind. Police reported crowds of curious onlookers rushing to see the disaster, only to get themselves trapped waist-deep, adding to the chaos. The molasses spread far beyond the immediate flood zone. Rescuers trudged into homes blocks away, only to find sticky footprints on the floorboards, walls stained with syrup, furniture coated in grime. The flood had seeped into basements, cellars, and sewers. The harbor itself ran brown for days as the tide carried the mess outward. And for months afterward, the city could not escape it. The sticky footprints of cleanup crews showed up in shops, in the subway, even in government buildings. The molasses followed you, a resident said. On your boots, in your hair, on your skin. You couldn't wash it away. But worse than the mess was the memory. Families who lost loved ones lived with the sound of those final cries. Neighbors pounded on walls, voices calling for help under rubble that rescuers never reached in time. Mothers buried children, wives buried husbands, children buried fathers. At night, some said, you could still hear the groans of the tank in your dreams. By day, when the sun heated the cobblestones, the air filled again with that hauntingly sweet scent. On a hot day, survivors later recalled, you could smell it for decades. For weeks, cleanup crews battled against the hardened sugar. Soldiers from the nearby Navy Yard joined in. They worked with fire hoses, shovels, and sheer muscle. Salt water pumped from the harbor stung their hands raw. Sand scraped their boots down to the leather. But the molasses clung stubbornly, as if it had claimed the neighborhood as its own. One by one, the bodies were pulled from the sludge. Some crushed beyond recognition, others eerily preserved in the sugary coating. 21 victims in all. Boston was left traumatized, not only by the deaths, but by the grotesque absurdity of it. People were supposed to drown in water, not molasses. Entire streets were supposed to burn down, not be embalmed in syrup. Yet here it was, a tragedy so bizarre it almost defied belief. Months later, the city was still scraping and scrubbing. Even after the last traces had been cleared away, the smell lingered. On hot summer days, Boston residents swore the air turned sweet again, an invisible reminder of the day molasses became a weapon. The flood was over, but its ghost would haunt the city for years. When the molasses was finally scraped from the streets and the bodies laid to rest, Boston still had one question burning in its heart. Who was to blame? The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, the giant that owned the Purity Distilling Company, had its answer ready. They told the public the flood wasn't their fault at all. No, they said, anarchists had blown up the tank. Sabotage. That was their story. It sounded convenient. After all, this was 1919, a time of political unrest, strikes, and fear of radicals. But for the families of the dead, that excuse rang hollow. They had seen the tank leak for years. They had heard the groans in the steel. They knew the truth. The company had built a time bomb, and it finally went off. So the lawsuits began. More than 100 claims poured in. Ordinary people, widows, parents, injured workers, stood up against a powerful corporation. The trial lasted 6 long years. Imagine that, 6 years of lawyers arguing over who was responsible for a wave of molasses. 6 years where families had to relive the horror again and again. In the courtroom, experts testified that the tank had been poorly designed from the very start. Thin steel walls, too few rivets, no real safety testing. The company's rush to profit had created a disaster waiting to happen. And slowly, the company's excuses crumbled. There was no bomb. No saboteurs. Just greed, shortcuts, and negligence. Finally, in 1925, Judge Hugh Ogden delivered his verdict. The company was guilty. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company was ordered to pay $628,000 in damages, a fortune at the time. Today, that would be worth more than $10 million. Families of the dead received about $7,000 each. For many, no amount of money could ever heal the loss, but at least the truth was clear. Their loved ones had been killed not by anarchists, but by corporate arrogance. But something else came out of the trial, something bigger than money. The case forced America to wake up. Until then, companies could build whatever they wanted, however they wanted, with little oversight. But the Great Molasses Flood showed what happens when profit matters more than people. Afterward, engineers had to sign off on major projects. Building codes became stricter. Safety testing was no longer optional. It was the law. And for the first time, corporations realized they could not simply hide behind excuses. They could be held accountable. Today, if you walk through Boston's North End, you won't see any trace of the giant tank. The streets are rebuilt, homes stand tall, children play where molasses once drowned the city. Only a small plaque reminds visitors of what happened there in 1919. But if you ask the old families of Boston, they'll tell you, on a hot summer day, when the sun bakes the cobblestones, you can still catch it, the faint, sickly sweet smell of molasses. A scent that whispers of greed, of tragedy, and of lives lost in one of the strangest disasters America has ever known. The flood is gone, but its lesson remains. It began with a rumble. It ended with silence. 21 lives were lost, hundreds scarred, and an entire city forever marked by something as unlikely as molasses. The people of Boston had no choice that day. They could not outrun it, they could not fight it, and they could not stop it. Their fate was sealed by steel too thin, rivets too few, and a company that chose profit over safety. That is the tragedy of the Great Molasses Flood, not just the horror of drowning in syrup, but the helplessness of ordinary people crushed by forces far beyond their control: greed, haste, and negligence. History remembers it as bizarre, almost absurd. But for the victims, there was nothing strange. There was only terror, darkness, and the slow, suffocating end. And on the hottest summer days in Boston, when the air turns faintly sweet, the city itself seems to whisper, "Never forget."